thank you for coming to our session entitled University 2053, How the Future of Teaching and Learning Will Impact Us All. I'm joined by my colleagues on this side, Dr. Rhiannon Birch, and on this side, Professor Claudia Lapping from IOE at UCL, and Rhiannon from Sums Consulting. The idea for this session came up as Rhiannon and I were having some conversations looking into perhaps the nearer future about what would happen to a degree with lifelong learning. What would happen to that kind of wrapper of learning? How would we accredit students who had perhaps got chunks of learning from 9 different universities? We've both done a course recently from King's College on the impact of generative AI on teaching and learning, really good course, recommended. And started to think ourselves about our own sort of practice around consultancy and the things that we were starting to talk to universities about and the impact that was going to have. And then much wider conversations about the generation of knowledge and the socialization of that knowledge. And what's our role as consultants, and what's all of our roles as professional services staff within universities to help our colleagues to think about those sorts of things. And so we wanted to do a session, and this is a session for all of us to help us think about how we're going to think about the future, because we got our crystal ball out and discovered that there is no one future. There are many, many potential futures, and that's what we're going to have a discussion about today. We needed, though, to reach out to someone who could help us think about how to think about the future, and hence Claudia has come to join us. Claudia is a professor of education. She is part of a team working on the MA in education at the IOE, and she is currently designing a module to help the educators of the future think about the future of education and their role in helping to shape that future. So Claudia, in the first part of the session today, Claudia is going to talk to us about a simple model of how we can potentially think about futures. And then Rhiannon and I are going to take us through a few concepts that we associate with teaching and learning, and how we might think about those concepts within a utopian model of the future, and conversely a dystopian model of the future. And then it's over to you. It's task time. We're going to set you a task. We're going to give you some potential scenarios of the future, which could be either utopian or dystopian. It's up to you to shape that scenario. You're going to have to think about the assumptions that you might make, and you're going to think about those concepts of teaching and learning within that scenario, and then be ready to share some of that thinking at the end. So that hopefully gives you an idea of what we're going to be doing for the next 45 or so minutes before lunch. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Claudia.
Okay, I'm going to just stand up because I can't quite see all of the notes. But what we're going to do, I think, is go from something quite abstract of how we think about the future and how different conceptions of the future might interrelate with the conception of the university into something concrete and specific to try to focus our thinking around that. And I was asked to kind of think about how do we, or conceptualize from a more philosophical standpoint, the future. And as Claire has already pointed out, and as is eminently clear from the times we're living in, we have no clue about the future. But there are different ways that the future has been theorized, and that history and the progress of history, or the non-progress of history, have been theorized. And they play out differently in the way that we might conceptualize the university and the function of the university, which relates a lot to what we were just hearing about in the just before the break. So before I kind of get to the slide, I suppose I'm thinking about something that you might call a Hegelian conception of history and the future, something like a Marxist conception of the progress of history in the future, and something like a postmodern conception of the future. So Hegel has an idea of the progress of history being driven by the idea, and there's some kind of notion within that, it's stupidly complex, of reason and progress. Marx, who I haven't put on the slide, inverts that and thinks about history as being driven by the economy and by the material, not by ideas. And we can sort of see some of that playing out very obviously in the way that the development of universities happens at the moment, driven by global economies. And then there's a more postmodern conception of the progress of history that says that we are not driven by reason. The progress of history isn't driven by idea and reason. It's more chaotic. And there's this kind of notion of skepticism towards meta-narratives of progress, and even the very idea of progress. So in, I've completely forgotten, Ken, what's his name before the...
Ken Sloan.
Ken Sloan was sort of, and in fact both of them were sort of trying to talk about how can we take control of the university and the idea of the university for the purpose of progress. And yet maybe our conception of history fights against that. So within that, you have different conceptions of the university that touch on things from this morning. So if you think of the progress of history and the human role within that as something that has reason and progress for the good, you think of universities perhaps, although that was troubled just before, as sort of autonomous bastions of rationality, guided by internal principles of research and learning, and contributing to knowledge, to the economy, to culture and national identity in a positive way. And you might think that's possible. You might think it's not totally possible, but we should be aiming at that. And that relates to a conception of a particular conception of history. And within that, you might then think of university staff as respected professionals, exercising autonomous judgment, supporting colleagues and students to enact that mission, a mission of contributing to society. And there was a notion of a university as a potentially geographic or sort of concrete site of reason, scientific method, and technology as a support for progress, which we heard a bit about also. But you might have a conception of history and therefore a conception of the university, and I think we all experience it now as something that doesn't easily fit that model. So universities as responsive to external imperatives, subservient to national, international and global markets and regulative bodies, that we don't have autonomy over our mission. We don't have autonomy over the kinds of knowledge we should be building, the people who come to university and what they might want. So it's hard to keep hold of what the mission of the university is. And these external forces continually recreate the value and meaning of knowledge and learning. So professional judgment gets displaced by digital and administrative systems. There's that question of data. Does data inform us and inform good decisions, or does data then come to control us? And we're controlled by the data that we're able to collect. So there are these administrative systems, league tables, measurable outputs that actually take away professional judgment. And in terms of spaces, there are these intersecting digital and geographic spaces, shifting criteria for truth. Technology has unpredictable and uncontrollable results. And so these are both contrasting conceptions of what the university might be able to struggle to be in the future, and also contrasting conceptions of how the history of human development, societies within that evolve. And I suppose that's a starting point for beginning to think about how do we position ourselves as people or professionals working within a university? How much agency do we have within these contrasting visions over what we might create as the university? And we had that optimistic vision just before the break, but I suppose being sort of realistic a little bit about whether we are being simply responsive to these sort of greater forces where we can make a difference. And so that's a kind of setting the scene at a very abstract level, and what we want to do is just give a little bit of more concrete framing for the task that we're going to ask you to do.
So we started to think about two different frames for a future. A frame in which we have a utopian vision of the future, and a frame in which we have a dystopian view for the view of the future. So we're here to mainly to talk around the teaching and learning area, and we're going to think about that under 5 sort of different concepts that feed into that. We've got something around knowledge and curriculum. We've got something around teaching and learning and assessment, and I'll talk about these a bit more in a minute. Lucy talked about technology and digital transformation. So how is that going to impact? There are also, real challenges at the moment around migration, intercultural communication, gender equity, wider diversity and inclusion issues. So how those things intersect in the future is going to be really interesting. So what becomes of knowledge in our utopian future? It's freely available, free in inverted commas, freely available, irrespective of the source, irrespective of where it's come from. Our concept of universities as being the main place in which knowledge is generated, I think the sector is going to be incredibly, it's going to be much more porous than that, both in terms of knowledge generation and in terms of teaching and learning. So the partnerships that are going to be required between all sorts of different institutions around knowledge generation and how that knowledge is then shared and socialized and built upon. Our curricula are going to be different in terms of the agility, things that we talk about now around quality being designed into our curricula, equality being designed into our curricula. The products themselves, we don't know whether we're going to have the same concepts of modules and programs, but our curriculum products are going to be much more flexible, much more portable when we come down to thinking about migration and intercultural communication. Technology as an enabler, there are a couple of things on the slide there. We've talked about personalized learning, but I think that's going to be supercharged into the future. The concept of our pan-global learning community will be realizable in a way that it certainly isn't now. Disciplinary boundaries will be broken down, and we'll go from discipline-oriented curricula and learning to much more problem-oriented learning. Perhaps in the future, in 2053, work as we currently know it won't be the same. AI will have transformed the world of work, and learning might be our ultimate leisure activity. Work may be knowledge generation, rather than mechanical or otherwise. Technology might be a means of acquiring knowledge. So another film looking into the future, which I saw just the other week, The Matrix, the idea that you can just download, how to fly a helicopter or any part of knowledge that you could want. What does higher learning mean in that sense then, if we can just download knowledge like that? Plenty of challenges, as I said, around migration and so forth. So that portability, that intersection of learning and knowledge and what those things mean across the different cultures, all of that will have been synthesized in higher learning. We will be in a post-gender society. What's that going to mean for learning and for our institutions? You may think of other things that exist within a utopia. So, for example, things like universal basic income and things like that. As you get into the task, some of those assumptions that you make will be important to note down. I'm now going to pass to Rhiannon, who's going to talk about the other framework.
Yes, so I get the bleak end of the scale. And in case you haven't realised, Claire and I both quite like sci-fi. So if you're interested in what the pictures are, do ask us afterwards. But I think this one's best characterised almost as 1984 meets Blade Runner. So it's really easy in terms of the utopian vision to think about that being a little bit more of a development from where we are now. In terms of the dystopian future, I think the important thing is that something has to have happened. And something has to have happened which has driven all the bits of human society at the moment that we really don't like and we really don't want to promote. So this is an extreme view. Again, we're looking across those same different factors. So where we got to was in terms of knowledge and the curriculum, actually, there's lots of different organisations that are doing their own curricula. So we ended up characterising this when we first talked about it in terms of chocolate bars. So for those of you who are old enough to remember opal fruits, actually, are your modules an individually wrapped piece that you can choose to put together as a packet? That works really well until you get to the point where there's no centralised control. There's no agreement on what counts as knowledge. People are effectively doing a Woolworths pick and mix with no bag. So there's that potentially flexibility around knowledge in the curriculum. But also, what if AI systems, and I have to admit, I learned a lot doing the course that Claire mentioned, in terms of what they can do, where they can be useful. Well, if that goes to its extreme, actually, if everybody puts in all of their notes for the AI to summarise and only reads the summary, what does that do for your depth of knowledge? How does that disrupt the idea of extended writing, of coherence, of the ability to use an apostrophe correctly? So those kinds of factors. In terms of teaching and assessment, if you have no quality control, if essay mills have gone to their extreme, then actually are you narrowing how we can look at knowledge, how you can verify that knowledge? Does it come down to fact-based stuff that you can prove rather than criticality and other skills that we're teaching in higher education? And does that actually mean that university degrees have been displaced? So everybody has individual suites, but you don't have the overall confirmed and accredited, validated wrapper. In things of technology and analysis, we are a little bit in 1984 with Big Brother watching you. Actually, what if content becomes something where if it's not uploaded, if it's not viewable by a central authority, it's not valid, and you end up with almost a counterculture of people talking outside of their formal education. And similarly, what if universities become funded based on what you put out through your content? So you're a content factory rather than an educational or a knowledge-based establishment. Inevitably, for this dystopian view, we started to have a few thoughts about society. So effectively where we've gone with this is actually there's continual mass migration. Nobody's staying in one place for very long. And what that means is that few people study consistently in one place. So campus-based provision then becomes problematic in that environment. But also, if you've got no centralised regulation and qualifications aren't recognised across borders, that would massively exclude people from having qualifications that are recognised. We went really bleak on this one, basically. But the final point of that, and you'll notice that there are 3 women on the panel as it sits. But what does that mean for gender equity in terms of access to education? So it could be that there is segregation. We've used men and women on this bit of the slide. There could be different types of segregation that happen within that kind of society if you've gone to an extreme and it's a bad extreme. So they're really just some thoughts to think about from the dystopian view, but I think one of my conclusions was actually it's a lot easier to think about a dystopian view following a revolution, whereas actually the utopian view is more, it's a developed change.
It's really interesting because for me, this is already where we are, more or less. So it depends. I thought the utopian one was a bit ridiculous, and this is kind of, it's way too familiar. So it's very interesting, different perspectives.
And interesting that we can think about several of those. I mean, those things are happening in the world at the moment. Afghanistan, migration through sub-Saharan Africa and so forth. Yeah, these things are happening. Okay,
so what we want you to do is, having sort of got you thinking about potential positive or negative or in-between things that might happen in these different areas, we want you to focus in your discussion on one of these particular scenarios and what the university and teaching and learning might look like in one of these scenarios. So a city-state dominated by big business and economic forces. You might think we're already there. You might think not. A region dominated by an extremist ideology. And the extremist ideology might be something negative, but it might be something really positive. It might be democratic learning. So, but what would it be what would you choose what your assumptions are for the scenario, and then think about what would higher education, what are the possibilities for learning in that scenario? A fully automated network. We thought about saying network society or network something else, but maybe it's just there's a fully automated network. We've almost got that. What does learning look like when you're just focusing on producing learning, producing something we might call higher learning, within something that is a fully automated system? And in contrast to that, a small rural community with little communication. So depending on which of these you choose, the kind of learning that you might be able to offer and provide and what learning might look like, we think will be quite different. So we'll be really interested to hear what you have to say about that.
So in terms of the discussion that we're asking you to have, you have flip charts, you have pens. How you wish to capture this is entirely up to you. But what we'd really like you to think about is what higher learning looks like in a scenario. So we've given you 4 options for what your scenario might look like. And I guess we're asking you to focus on 3 questions in your discussion. Actually, is your scenario a utopian or a dystopian vision? And what are the assumptions around that? So we've given you some very extreme assumptions when we played this game effectively, but what are your assumptions around what the scenario for higher learning might look like? And then within that, we gave 5 factors of things that you could look at, different characteristics or parts of the education picture that you could look at. So could you, as a group, elaborate your vision of how 1 or 2 of those 5 areas might look within that scenario that you've developed for yourselves based on one of those 4?
Okay.
So the 5 areas being knowledge and the curriculum. Yeah, sorry, there you go.
Yeah, so that summarises your task. So we've got the 4 scenarios up on the left, the 5 different areas, and then the questions. Any questions from the floor before we get you started? No. Excellent.
It's really just a chance to play, but hopefully explore in a more focused way, taking one of these scenarios and focusing in on one of the 5 areas of teaching and learning and work that the university does.
Yeah, so I think we're pretty much split up. Maybe that table at the back, if you guys want to sort of spread out a bit more. Conversation probably best had in 3s, 4s and 5s, if possible. Away you go. They all look shell-shocked.
Yeah. It's fine. They're good. In a minute.
We shall be wandering around to help you out.
Yeah. Yep.
Good. Thank you very much, everybody. Right, we've got about 5 minutes or so before we're all going to head down to lunch. So let's just take a little bit of feedback on that session. Hopefully you all had some really interesting discussions. Quickly, some hands just to see where what we did. Who picked the city-state big business scenario? 1, 2, 3, 4 of you. Okay, cool. Who picked the extremist ideology? Did we have any takers for an extremist ideology? No? Okay. We won't cover that one then. Did anyone pick computers took over the world, the iRobot scenario? No? Interesting.
Network society. You did. Yeah.
Network society. Okay, cool. And
fully
so the rest of you were on rural communities, right? Yeah, rural communities. Okay, good. Let's have a volunteer from the city-state side of things. Who wants to volunteer? City-state folk.
Is that this table?
That table there. Go on, you've just volunteered yourself. Well done. Good work. Come on then. So, did you choose dystopia, utopia? What were some of your assumptions? Which areas did you pick, and what was the impact on that area?
Yeah, so we did go for the sort of city-state utopian society where everything's really driven by the sort of corporate states, and we looked at teaching and assessment and how that has to radically change, and the idea that it's more about creating a rounded individual who can do critical thinking and work within society than knowledge, which, because you just Google the knowledge part. So less task-based, more critical thinking, blue ocean type stuff for the corporates, being able to, one of the assessment criteria might be you have a job. Microsoft's giving you a job and you're progressing through Microsoft rather than a piece of paper. So moving away from, sort of task, knowledge, qualifications, and moving into creating a rounded individual who can do critical thinking, who can work within society and succeed. So that was sort of the utopian view, and the assessment bit is very much driven by the corporate need, which is you've developed them well enough to get a job within Salesforce, Microsoft. Did we say anything else? What else do we have on there? Hold on, I can't see the bottom half.
Okay, in terms of the city-state one, did anyone take a dystopian view of the city-state? Okay, come on then, Kay. Wait for the microphone.
Yeah. Okay, it's not karaoke, is it? So we went back to Ken's point earlier, which was kind of universities being these glorified HR departments with big businesses almost like controlling the curriculum and the learning outcomes to suit to their own ends. So academic freedom completely stifled, and probably taking us through from very early education right the way through, with the danger of your data being used to almost like stereotype you and put you into a theme more and more. Yep. So it's almost like the sausage factory when you spit out and you're kind of sent to work in one of these companies. We were concerned for things like equality, both gender and race equality, in terms of having these experience early in life and then getting stereotyped and that kind of following through on your learning journey. We thought there was kind of lack of, it would restrict experimentation, danger of taking away choice and imposing control upon us. Anything I've missed?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, just about control. Yeah.
Thank you.
It's pretty bleak.
Yeah. Pretty bleak, yeah. We're going to come to this group over here. If you did the automated network, what were your thoughts? Did you go utopian or dystopian on that? And who wants to be the spokesperson for the group?
Just to say, I did take the notes. We didn't do gender equality, but as the sole man on this group. So we did, fully automated network, dystopian, teaching and assessment. And sort of two types of assumption, but the first one, if there's any group that actually sits above or owns the network, then that would be a kind of a small elite. They'd have access to sort of a full spectrum higher learning, so they could study the humanities, arts, etc. But that would obviously be generated by an increasingly narrow kind of group and input. There'd be a sort of a middle class who'd learn what's needed only to maintain the network. But the masses would get no access, there's no value add. They'd have no time, as they'd be scrabbling to survive, as there'd be no jobs. So it's quite bleak. But then it gets bleaker if there's no one above the network. What we sort of concluded that higher learning would die out. No one would be sort of allowed or involved in doing it. Then the knowledge would get wiped, overwritten over time by the network, sort of be life of a mayfly kind of thing. And in either example, biases would be built in, exacerbated the inequalities we've got today. And if there is an ownership class, then that would entrench and exacerbate kind of their wealth and inequality. It's all quite bleak.
That is incredibly bleak. Okay. Who's got a rural community with a utopian vision after that to reset ourselves? Who wants to? Who did a utopian rural community? Okay, coming to you, Nina.
Thank you. So for a bit of light relief after that scenario, we picked a small rural community. There was some debate about whether it could have little communication in this day and age with the advent of mobile technologies, etc. And we had a utopian vision for this community. We made some assumptions about the fact that it's a choice. So the people living in this community have chosen to be separate from large cities. The community want to understand how they can maintain and develop their lives in that context. And there isn't a lack of an awareness about the wider world, but it's definitely a choice to move out of cities and to continuously adapt in that circumstance. We had quite some debate about what higher learning is. Is it creating new knowledge? Is it applying knowledge to solve problems and find new solutions? Is it about developing skills to question and debate? So what would teaching and learning and what would a curriculum look like in this sort of context? Well, we thought that actually the community kind of owns and develops its own knowledge. So it's not necessarily how they access knowledge from elsewhere, it's about how they create it. And we talked about the horizontal transfer of knowledge in that community. So there's really critical engagement with what they want to learn, and it's very community driven. And then we ended up by questioning whether that might mean the end of the university as we know it. So perhaps it wasn't that optimistic after all, but that's where we got to.
Okay, brilliant. We've run over a little bit on time, but forgive me because there's some really interesting things, and hopefully that sparked the discussions that you've had. Continue them over lunch. That's your next on your agenda. Downstairs at the back of the room into the Tavistock room where the exhibitors are. That's where lunch will be held. After lunch, we're back in here at 1:45, yes, Fola? So 1:45, pronto, for Fola's session on solution rooms. So we've had a very divergent explorative session now. Take that forwards and into those sessions where we'll be doing some more perhaps convergent thinking on some solutions to some of the challenges that as universities, as professional services folk within universities, we'll be facing over the next 5 to 10 years. So thank you very much. Thank you very much to Claudia for joining us today, and thank you to Rhiannon as well.